In the year of our Lord 1347, when the borderlands ran red with the blood of two kingdoms locked in endless war, a fallen knight made a choice that would echo through the halls of history. He saw not an enemy's daughter, but a soul yearning to defend what she loved. What began as simple lessons in a moonlit glade would topple crowns and forge peace from the ashes of hatred. This is the tale of how mercy conquered vengeance, and how the greatest victory often comes disguised as defeat. Join us on this journey through medieval honor and sacrifice. Subscribe and ring the bell to witness how one knight's act of kindness changed the destiny of two kingdoms forever. Now let our chronicle begin. The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks, like the ghosts of fallen warriors, as Sir Gareth of Blackmoor guided his destrier through the borderlands. 3 years had passed since King Aldric's forces had razed his family's holdings, leaving naught but charred stones and bitter memories. The golden griffin that once adorned his surcoat had long since been torn away, replaced by simple brown wool that marked him as masterless. A knight-errant seeking purpose in a world that had stripped him of everything save his sword and his honor. The village of Millhaven lay nestled in a valley where the morning sun painted the thatched roofs gold. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of the miller's wheel echoed across the stream. It was here in this peaceful hamlet that sat precariously between the domains of two warring kings that Gareth sought shelter and perhaps a few days' work to earn bread and ale. The inn's common room bore the scars of the ongoing conflict, patched walls where arrows had found their mark, and faces etched with the weariness of those who lived ever in fear of the next raid. Gareth took his place in a corner, his weathered hands wrapped around a wooden cup, listening to the hushed conversations of merchants and farmers who spoke in careful whispers of troop movements and burned harvests. It was the innkeeper's daughter who served him, a lass of perhaps 16 summers with eyes the color of storm clouds and hair that caught the firelight like spun copper. She moved with a grace that spoke of noble bearing, though her hands showed the calluses of honest labor. When she set down his trencher of bread and cheese, Gareth noticed something that made his warrior's instincts stir. The faint marks upon her palms that spoke of sword practice, and the way she carried herself with the balanced poise of one trained in combat. "You handle yourself as one who knows the weight of steel, young maiden," Gareth observed quietly, his voice carrying the gravel of many battles. The girl, who called herself Mara, startled like a deer caught drinking at stream's edge. Her eyes darted toward the stairs where her supposed father worked his ledgers, then back to the knight, whose keen gaze seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed deception. "I know not of what you speak, good sir," she whispered, but her hand instinctively moved to her hip where a sword might rest. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of wine and gold, Gareth followed the sound of steel ringing against wood. Deep in the forest glade behind the village he found her, the innkeeper's daughter who was no innkeeper's daughter at all. She moved through sword forms with the desperate intensity of one who knew her life might depend upon such skill. Yet her technique bore the flaws of one who had learned in secret, without proper guidance. Her wooden practice sword caught moonbeams as she spun and thrust, her breath coming in short gasps of frustration when a movement went awry. Sweat beaded upon her brow despite the cool night air, and Gareth could see in her every motion the burning desire to master the warrior's art. "Your stance leaves your left flank exposed," he said softly, stepping into the clearing with his hands raised to show he meant no harm. Mara whirled, her practice blade held in a guard position that was nearly correct. "You followed me," she accused, though her voice trembled more with embarrassment than anger. "Aye, that I did." Gareth moved with the careful grace of a man who had spent decades learning to read the intentions of others. "I see in you something that stirs memories of my own youth, the hunger to prove oneself, to stand ready when darkness falls." In the moonlight, her young face showed a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within the battle-hardened knight's chest. Here was someone who understood the weight of responsibility, who felt the call to protect others, even when the world would deny her the right to do so. "Why do you train in secret, child?" Gareth asked, settling himself upon a fallen log with the casual ease of one accustomed to making camp beneath the stars. For a long moment, Mara remained poised for flight, her wooden sword still held before her like a barrier between them. Then, perhaps sensing something trustworthy in this weathered stranger, she allowed the weapon to drop to her side. "Because I must," she said simply. "Because when the raiders come, and they always come, someone must stand ready to defend those who cannot defend themselves." Gareth studied her face in the pale light, seeing there an echo of his own younger self, when duty and honor had seemed like bright banners worth following into any darkness. The irony was not lost on him that here, in this border village caught between warring realms, he had found someone who still believed in the ideals that the world had nearly crushed from his own heart. "The sword is but one tool of war," he said at length. "If you would truly defend this place, you must learn the lance as well. Mounted combat is the realm of knights, and against mounted foes, the sword alone will not suffice." Hope flickered in her storm-grey eyes, like candlelight in a draught. "You would teach me?" Gareth was quiet for a long moment, listening to the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of a night bird. 3 years of wandering had taught him that purpose could be found in the most unexpected places, and perhaps this young woman's determination was exactly the kind of pure motivation his cynical heart needed to remember why he had once believed in chivalry. "Aye," he said finally. "I will teach you what I can, though I warn you, the path of the warrior is paved with sacrifice and sorrow as much as glory." As Mara's face lit with gratitude and determination, neither teacher nor student could have imagined how those words would prove prophetic, nor how the lessons they were about to begin would echo through the halls of 2 kingdoms and change the course of history itself. The weeks that followed became a sacred ritual written in sweat and moonlight. Each night after the village had settled into slumber and the inn fires had dimmed to glowing embers, Gareth would make his way to the forest glade where Mara waited with the patience of a true student. He had procured for her a proper practice lance, not the massive war spear of mounted knights, but a lighter weapon suited to her build and strength. "The lance is not merely a tool for charging," Gareth instructed on their 3rd night together, his voice carrying across the clearing like the wisdom of ages. "It is an extension of your will, your reach, your very soul made manifest in ash and steel." Under his tutelage, Mara learned to plant her feet with the firmness of oak roots, to pivot her hips and shoulders in harmony, to thrust with the full power of her body behind the weapon's point. Her natural grace, which Gareth had noted from their first meeting, served her well as she absorbed each lesson with the focused intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. "Why did you choose the path of arms?" Gareth asked one evening as they rested between practice sessions, sharing water from his leather flask. Mara was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed upon the stars that wheeled overhead like distant campfires. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experiences far beyond her apparent years. "I have seen what happens to those who cannot defend themselves," she said quietly. "I have watched good people suffer while others stood by, either too weak or too afraid to act. If I have the strength to stand between innocence and cruelty, then is it not my duty to do so?" Her words stirred something in Gareth's chest, an echo of the young knight he had once been, before loss and betrayal had taught him the bitter lessons of the world. In her earnest face, he saw reflected the ideals he had thought lost forever. As the days shortened and autumn painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Mara's skill with the lance grew from awkward fumbling to fluid competence. She learned to read the subtle shifts in an opponent's stance that telegraphed their next move, to use her smaller size as an advantage rather than a weakness, to strike with precision rather than brute force. "How you have the makings of a true warrior," Gareth told her one crisp October evening as she completed a series of complex thrusts and parries without error. "Your heart is pure, your dedication unwavering, and your natural instincts sharp as any blade I have known." The pride that shone in Mara's eyes at his praise was worth more to Gareth than any payment of gold. In teaching her, he had rediscovered something he had thought lost forever, the joy of nurturing noble purpose in another soul. But their peaceful routine was shattered on a night when the autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and the distant sound of screaming. From the direction of the village came the orange glow of flames and the harsh voices of men drunk on violence and conquest. "Raiders," Gareth breathed, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. Mara was already moving, her practice lance gripped in her hands with deadly intent. "My people," she whispered, then louder with steel in her voice. "My people need me." "Wait," Gareth called, but she was already running toward the village, her training transformed in an instant from careful exercise to desperate necessity. By the time they reached the edge of the settlement, the attack was in full swing. 24 mounted men in the colors of King Aldric's forces had descended upon Millhaven like wolves upon a sheepfold. Houses blazed, villagers scattered in terror, and the sounds of combat echoed through streets that had known peace for too brief a time. Gareth felt the familiar ice-cold clarity of battle settle over his mind, but beside him, Mara had transformed into something he had never seen before. Gone was the earnest student, replaced by a figure of terrible purpose and grace. She moved through the chaos like a dancer, her lance finding its mark with deadly precision. A mounted warrior bore down upon a family huddled by the well, his sword raised for a killing blow. Mara stepped into his path, her lance thrust upward with perfect form, taking the rider from his saddle with a move that Gareth himself could not have executed more flawlessly. "For Millhaven," she cried, her voice carrying across the square like a battle horn. "Stand and fight! Let them know the price of our blood!" Her courage was infectious. Villagers who had been fleeing in terror turned back with whatever weapons they could find: pitchforks, hammers, kitchen knives. Inspired by this young woman who fought with the skill of a seasoned knight, they formed a defensive line around the well, protecting their families and neighbors. Gareth found himself fighting beside her, his sword weaving patterns of death as he covered her flanks. Together, they carved through the raiders like a scythe through wheat, their partnership forged in the crucible of desperate battle. When the last of the attackers had fled or fallen, the village square was littered with the detritus of war. But Millhaven still stood, and at its center, breathing hard but victorious, stood Mara with her lance still held ready, her eyes blazing with the fierce joy of righteous victory. It was then, in that moment of triumph, that one of the fallen raiders gasped out words that turned Gareth's blood to ice water in his veins. "Princess, Princess Ilara, the king, your father." As understanding dawned like a cold sunrise, Gareth stared at the young woman he had trained, had grown to admire, had come to think of almost as a daughter. The storm-grey eyes, the noble bearing, the natural grace with weapons, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. Princess Ilara of Aldric's realm, daughter of the king who had destroyed everything Gareth had ever loved, stood before him with her lance still dripping with the blood of her own father's soldiers, her chest heaving with exhaustion and the fierce pride of someone who had just saved the lives of people she considered her own. The cruel irony of fate had never cut so deeply. Dawn broke grey and cold over Millhaven, painting the smoke-stained buildings in shades of ash and sorrow. The villagers moved through their settlement like souls awakening from a nightmare, tending to wounds both physical and spiritual, as they counted the cost of the night's battle. 3 good men lay dead, their blood seeping into the earth they had worked and loved. But the toll could have been far worse without the intervention of the mysterious Maiden, who had fought like an avenging angel. Gareth sat alone by the village well, his sword across his knees, watching as Princess Ilara, for he could no longer think of her as simple Mara, moved among the wounded with gentle hands and healing herbs. Her transformation in the night's aftermath was as complete as it had been during the battle itself. Gone was the fierce warrior who had stood against mounted knights with nothing but a lance and iron will. In her place moved a healer, a comforter, someone who understood that victory meant nothing if compassion did not follow in its wake. The innkeeper, who was, Gareth now realized, likely some loyal retainer charged with her protection, approached with weary steps and eyes that held decades of worry. "She means to tell you the truth herself," the old man said quietly, settling beside the knight with the creaking joints of one who had lived too long with the weight of secrets. "She values your good opinion above rubies and gold." "And what would you have me do with this truth?" Gareth asked, his voice hollow as an empty helm. "What does one do when duty and honor pull in opposite directions like horses yoked to different carts?" The innkeeper was quiet for a long moment, watching as Ilara knelt beside a wounded farmer, her hands sure and gentle as she bound his wounds with strips torn from her own undergarments. "I have served her family for 40 years, he said at length. "I knew her as a babe who wept when sparrows fell from their nests, who gave away her finest gowns to children shivering in winter's cold. Whatever darkness you may see in her father's crown, it does not live in her heart. Gareth said nothing, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped his sword's crossguard. King Aldric the Ruthless, they called him in the taverns and market squares. The man who had ordered the burning of Blackmoor, who had scattered Gareth's family to the four winds like autumn leaves. The man whose daughter now approached with halting steps and eyes that held the weight of revelation. "Sir Gareth," she began, then stopped, her usually confident voice trembling like a leaf in winter wind. "There are words I must speak, though they may cost me the only friendship I have known in these dark years." "I know who you are, Your Highness," Gareth said softly, rising to his feet with the formal precision of a knight in the presence of royalty. "Princess Ilara of the House of Aldric, daughter of my sworn enemy." The title hung between them like a blade, cutting through weeks of easy companionship and shared purpose. Ilara's face went pale as morning mist, but she did not flinch from the weight of his gaze. "Then you know why I could not speak the truth before," she whispered. "You know why I hid here among simple folk, learning their ways and their sorrows. You know why I trained in secret, preparing to defend a people my father would see as nothing more than pawns in his grand strategy of conquest." "What I know," Gareth said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man who had lost everything to the whims of kings, "is that you are the blood of the man who burned my home, scattered my family, and left me masterless in a world that cares nothing for justice." Tears gathered in Ilara's storm-grey eyes, but she held her ground with the courage he had come to admire. "I that I am the daughter of a king who believes that strength alone makes right, who sees mercy as weakness and compromise as defeat. But I am also the woman who stood with these people last night, who would die before seeing them harmed." Around them, the villagers had begun to gather, drawn by the tension that crackled between knight and princess like lightning before a storm. They looked upon their defender with faces full of confusion and growing understanding, seeing for the first time the noble bearing that had always marked her as different. "You trained me knowing I was your enemy's child," Ilara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You taught me not just the forms of combat, but the meaning of honor, the weight of responsibility, the price of standing between the innocent and those who would do them harm. If that makes me traitor to my father's cause, then I embrace that treason with all my heart." An old woman stepped forward from the crowd, the baker's wife, whose grandsons Ilara had pulled from the path of charging horses during the night's battle. Her weathered hands shook as she reached out to touch the princess's tear-stained cheek. "Royal blood or common, you are our Mara," she said with the simple dignity of one who had lived long enough to know that worth was measured in deeds, not bloodlines. "You bled for us, fought for us, saved our children. What care we for the name your father gave you?" Others nodded their agreement, and Gareth felt something shift in his chest as he watched this young woman, this enemy's daughter, surrounded by the love and loyalty of people who had every reason to hate her lineage. In their faces, he saw reflected the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to first take up the sword in defense of his own family's lands. "You ask me to choose," Gareth said slowly, his internal struggle written in the lines of his weathered face. "Between the oath of vengeance I swore over my family's ashes and the loyalty I have come to feel for the woman who fought beside me in defense of the innocent." Ilara straightened, her chin lifting with royal pride even as tears continued to track down her cheeks. "I ask nothing of you, Sir Gareth. You have already given me more than I deserved. You saw worth in a girl playing at swords in the moonlight and made her into someone capable of standing against darkness. Whatever comes next, I will carry that gift with me always." As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night's shadows, Gareth found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his days. Behind him lay the comfortable certainty of hatred, the simple clarity of a sworn enemy to pursue and destroy. Before him stood a young woman who embodied everything he had once believed the ideals of knighthood should represent: courage, compassion, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the greater good. In the end, it was not duty or honor that decided him, but the memory of her voice crying out in the darkness, for Millhaven. Not for her father's kingdom or her own glory, but for the simple folk who had taken her in and treated her as family. The choice, when it came, was simpler than he had thought it would be. 3 days after the battle, riders approached Millhaven under banners that made the villagers scatter like sparrows before a hawk. King Aldric himself rode at their head, his crown catching the afternoon sun like captured fire, his face a mask of royal fury that had summoned armies and toppled cities. Behind him came 200 of his finest knights, their armor gleaming and their lances held ready for war. But it was not war they found in the village square. Instead, they discovered their princess standing beside a weathered knight-errant, both of them flanked by common folk who held farming tools and kitchen knives with the grim determination of those who had already chosen to die for something greater than themselves. "Daughter," King Aldric's voice carried across the square like the rumble of distant thunder. "You will come with us. Now." "No, father," Ilara replied, her voice clear and unwavering despite the terrible odds arrayed against her. "I will not abandon these people to suffer for my choices." The king's eyes, grey as winter storms and just as cold, fixed upon Gareth with the weight of absolute authority. "And you, Sir Knight, for I know you to be more than the masterless wanderer you pretend, you dare to corrupt my daughter with your poison." Gareth stepped forward, his hand resting easy on his sword hilt, despite the forest of spears pointed in his direction. "I am Sir Gareth of Blackmoor, your majesty, son of Lord Marcus, whom your forces slew 3 years past. I have every reason to hate you and all your bloodline." A murmur ran through the assembled knights, for the destruction of Blackmoor was well known throughout the realm, a harsh lesson in the price of opposing the king's will. Aldric's eyes narrowed as he studied this ghost from his past campaigns. "Then why?" the king asked slowly. "Do you stand beside my daughter instead of putting your blade through her heart?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with the weight of years and the ghosts of old grievances. Gareth felt the eyes of both armies upon him, Aldric's knights with their hands on their weapons, the villagers with their desperate hope, and Princess Ilara with something deeper than hope shining in her storm-grey eyes. "Because she is not you," Gareth said simply. "Because I have watched her choose mercy over vengeance, service over dominion, love over fear. Because she fought not for conquest or glory, but to protect people who had no one else to stand for them." He gestured toward the villagers who surrounded them, his voice carrying the conviction of absolute truth. "These people call her daughter not because of royal blood, but because she has proven herself worthy of that love through deed and sacrifice. She is what you could have been, what your kingdom could become if only you had the wisdom to see strength in compassion rather than conquest." King Aldric dismounted, his boots ringing against the cobblestones as he approached his daughter. For a moment, father and daughter stood face to face, and those watching could see the family resemblance in the set of their jaws, the steel in their spines, the fire that burned behind their eyes. "You would choose these peasants over your birthright?" the king asked, his voice softer now but no less dangerous. "You would throw away a crown for the love of commoners?" "I would choose to be worthy of any crown I might wear," Ilara replied. "A throne built upon the suffering of innocence is no throne worth having." The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring drawn taut, broken only by the whisper of wind through the village streets and the distant sound of a church bell tolling the hour. Then, impossibly, King Aldric began to laugh, not the bitter sound of mockery, but something deeper and more complex. "By the saints," he said, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder, "you sound exactly like your mother did when she was your age and full of righteous fire." His eyes moved to Gareth, studying the knight with new interest. "And you, Sir Gareth of Blackmoor, one you have taught my daughter well, perhaps too well for my own comfort." The king walked slowly around the square, his gaze taking in the rebuilt houses, the carefully tended gardens, the faces of people who had learned to hope again despite living in the shadow of endless war. "This village," he said at length, "sits at the crossroads between my realm and that of King Edmund the Bold. For generations it has been burned and rebuilt, conquered and reconquered, its people used as pawns in a game of kings." He stopped before an old man whose arm bore fresh bandages from the recent battle. "Tell me, Goodman, what would you have of your king?" The villager looked around nervously, clearly unused to being addressed by royalty, but Princess Ilara nodded encouragingly, and he found his voice. "Peace, your majesty," he said simply. "We want only to work our fields, raise our children and live without fear of the next army that comes down the road." King Aldric nodded slowly, as if the old man had confirmed something he had long suspected. "And if I were to offer you a choice, to remain part of my kingdom but with certain protections, certain rights that even I could not revoke. What would you say to that? Hope flickered in faces that had learned not to trust in royal promises. The baker's wife, the same woman who had declared Ilara to be their Mara, regardless of bloodline, stepped forward with the courage of someone who had already lost everything worth losing. We would say that words are wind, Your Majesty, unless there are deeds to give them weight. The king smiled then, and for the first time Gareth caught a glimpse of the man Ilara might have inherited her compassion from, buried deep beneath years of war and the hardness that power demanded. Then let there be deeds, Aldrich declared, his voice carrying across the square with royal authority. Let this village be a sanctuary, neutral ground where no army may pass without invitation, where disputes between kingdoms are settled with words rather than swords. He looked at his daughter with something that might have been pride. And let it be governed by one who has proven herself willing to die for its people, Princess Ilara, first protector of Millhaven. The cheer that rose from the villagers could have been heard in the next county, but Gareth found his attention fixed on the moment when father and daughter embraced, their differences not forgotten, but transformed into something that might, in time, become understanding. As the sun set over Millhaven that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sir Gareth stood at the edge of the village watching King Aldrich's forces depart. The king had offered him lands and title, restoration of all that had been taken from his family, but Gareth had declined. Some wounds ran too deep for royal favor to heal, but that did not mean forgiveness was impossible. "Will you stay?" Princess Ilara asked, approaching with the quiet step of one who had learned to move like a warrior. "For a time," Gareth replied. "Someone must help train the village guard, and I find I have grown fond of teaching." She smiled then, the same expression of joy he had seen in the moonlit glade when she first mastered a difficult technique. "Then perhaps you might teach me something more. How to govern with wisdom rather than force, how to build bridges instead of walls." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Gareth nodded his agreement. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. In teaching an enemy's daughter to wield a lance, he had accidentally forged a peace that might outlast them all. Sometimes, the greatest victories came disguised as defeat, and the most important battles were won not with swords, but with the simple choice to see humanity in one's enemies. In the chronicles of both kingdoms, they would remember this as the year when a fallen knight and a hidden princess proved that honor was not about the cause you served, but about the people you chose to protect. And in the village of Millhaven, children would grow up hearing the tale of how their protector learned to fight not from hatred, but from love, and how that lesson changed the world.